Hello, I'm Ramjee Chandran and I welcome you to the History of Bangalore. This is Season 1, Episode 37. It is also Part 2 of my series on the Hoysalas, and I start today with the earliest known recorded history of that dynasty and their rise to dominate the politics of the South Deccan. At every point in history, it is a good idea to look forward to a future point in the same history, and what we see happening in later years gives us a way to better understand the period we are looking at. Here's an example in our own case. Right now, we are looking at the early 11th century, that's just after 1000 AD, at the beginning of the political history of the Hoysala Empire. At the time, the dominant forces in the south were Choras and the Chalukyas. When we jump ahead only a few hundred years towards the early 1300s, we see at that point that the Deccan came to be dominated by four kingdoms, the Pandyas and the Hoysalas in the south, and the Kakatiyas and the Yadavas towards the north of the Deccan. And they established themselves on the ruins of the earlier kingdoms. Later, the rise of the Arab and Turkic forces in the area would upset these kingdoms and set the stage for the establishment of the Bahmani and the Vijayanagara kingdoms towards the middle of the 14th century. So now we have a pretty good understanding of what lies on the road ahead and how things went at a brisk pace through the centuries. And today we get to feast on the details of the present. But all that as soon as I take a brief moment to say thank you to the Prestige Group for their generous sponsorship of this podcast. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. All right, let's jump in. One of the first things to examine is what were the Hoysalas doing before they came to power. In the previous episode, I went over their origins as rugged and violent hill people, to their employment by the chieftains, to their eventual integration into society, and their rise to power to rule that society. An incredible tale of a people who started out in the forest and hills, living maybe as one rung above the rest of the animal kingdom, and after centuries and generations, showed the sort of sophistication that would be deeply ingrained in someone cultured enough to have built some of the most wondrous architecture and sculpture, the Chennakeshava temple being only one of them. Now, having risen to the top of society and politics, it's back to my question, what were they doing before they ruled the land? It is necessary to ask this question because it is unlikely that they just came out of nowhere and established a dynasty. The reason is, above and beyond a good grip on statecraft, common sense dictates that running a kingdom requires a number of things. The most important of all is knowing people, the palace insiders, who's who in the structure of the administration of the country being invaded, a considerable amount of intel on whom to court and cajole and whom to kill. They have to know how things work and not be clueless. Maybe this is one of the reasons that successful coups have always been known to be carried out by feudatories or others close to the structure of power, like palace insiders or a sibling. With this in view, it encourages researchers to look for connections. And from that effort, it appears that the first signs of the Hoysalas were in the records of the Ganga dynasty, and the first king of the Hoysalas was Nripa Kama II. Like everything else, there's some debate about it, which I will get to later in this podcast. But talking about the previous episode, I went over the story of Sala, who killed the tiger and saved his guru. In some records, it is believed that Salah was the founder of the Hoysala dynasty, and he was the first king. But there is nothing firm that ties him to this reality. Even the story of him killing the tiger only turned up on an inscription in 1190 AD, and that would be during the time of Veerabalala, well over a century after it is said to have happened. But what we do know is there is some evidence to suggest that the early Hoysalas were closely affiliated to the Gangas and later to the western or Kalyani Chalukyas and briefly in the middle to the Choras. In 1006 AD, the inscription that recounts the Battle of Kaliyur mentions the name Hoysala as being one of 18 chieftains who attacked the Choras in the battle across the river from Talakadu. Now, they lost the Battle of Kaliyur badly, but they won a new resolve. If you get the time, please catch the episode titled The Battle of Kaliyur, where I discuss the question of whether the Hoysala mentioned on that inscription was an early Hoysala. And that possibility increases when one considers that the historian Kamath points out that in another record, Nripa Kama is referred to with the title Peramadi, which is a definite indication of the Hoysala affiliation with the Gangas. Now, as an aside, speaking to the beauty and the sophistication of Hoysala artistry that I referred to earlier, historian Benjamin Lewis Rice had this comment on the beauty of the Hoysala inscriptions. They are mostly on prepared slabs of black hornblende and are remarkable for their beautiful and artistic execution, the whole being so skillfully engrossed that, notwithstanding ornamental flourishes and pictorial initials, no space is left for the insertion of a single additional letter. Now, there are other theories that the chieftain called Hoysala in the Battle of Kaliyur was actually Nripa Kama himself, and he was a general in the Ganga army. Another theory is that it was Sala, and he was a feudatory of the Gangas in the Malnad area. Now, all of these are plausible, and one of them is probably true. But to answer the question I raised earlier, by one of these possibilities, it is understandable that the Hoysalas were active in the politics of the region when they challenged power, and therefore conclude that they were ready and able to take the throne. Now, to the question, who did it? It raises another question. While Nripa Kama is generally acknowledged as the first king of the Hoysalas, was Sala, who saved the Guru from the tiger, the same man as Nripa Kama? While this debate rages on about who was who, there is another interesting theory that emerged that makes sense. It makes common sense, and this speaks to the question of the Hoysala rise as chieftains. This account was covered in a book called the Mackenzie Collection. The subtitle of the book describes its contents: a descriptive catalogue of the Oriental manuscripts and other articles illustrative of the literary, history, statistics and antiquities of the south of India, collected by the late Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie, Surveyor General of India. And the book lives up to its subtitle. The Mackenzie Collection includes an account that suggests that Sala had indeed killed the tiger, but had not done so because he was nobly trying to save his guru. Instead, he had done this at the behest of the villagers in the area. The account says that a particular tiger had started to become a source of great worry for the village. The tiger had been terrorizing the area so badly that people were too afraid even to gather for the annual Vasantika festival. So, Sala killed the tiger. And once Sala had freed them from this menace, they were so relieved that they agreed to honor their commitment to pay him a yearly contribution of 1 fanam per family. Now, a fanam, around 1900 when it was calculated, would have been worth approximately 4 annas and 8 paise, and that relates to 33 paise today. It's anyone's guess what a fanam would be in today's money. But even back in Sala's day, it seemed like a modest reward for such a heroic deed. So the amount was doubled in the second year, tripled in the third, and kept increasing for 5 years. Sala, staying true to his promise, laid the money at the feet of the Jain Guru, the Muni whom he is supposed to have saved. But by the second year, the Muni instructed him to use it to build a small force, which grew into a respectable army by the 5th year. And the money had grown to such a respectable amount that the Guru is said to have directed Sala to rebuild the ruined city of Ikshvapuri, which is probably Dwarasamudra, which is now Halebeedu. And he promised Sala that he would find treasure among the ruins to fund its fortifications. Now, whether Sala found treasure as predicted by the Jain Muni or not is not known, but the city of Belur Halebeed would go on to become the capital of the Hoysalas. Now, before I take a commercial break, let me point out that the various stories of Sala differ remarkably from one another in many ways, but all of them agree that there was a tiger and there was Sala. That said, there are a few who insist that the tiger was indeed a lion. But however romantic and contrarian that notion be, I believe that lions were not native to the area, they still aren't, and tigers are. When I come back, I start with the people behind the beginnings of the Hoysala Empire and how they became one of the most powerful kingdoms in the land. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Right before the break, I told the more practical version of Sala's rise to power, which is that he protected the villagers from a rogue tiger in exchange for an annual payment paid for by all the villagers. I also mentioned that the Jain Muni had directed Sala to use the money to rebuild and fortify the old city of Dwarasamudra, which is the old name for Belur Halebeed, and thus set in place Sala's rise to power as the founder of the Hoysala dynasty. The source of this version of this story is a historical document that is written in Persianized Kannada, or Kannada with influences of Persian if you like. It's part of a genre of records known as the Kaifiyats, which were essentially reports or summaries about villages, towns or regions, and they were compiled during the early colonial period, which is really the same as during the reign of the Wadiyars. Now the Halebeedu Kaifiyat provides valuable information about the history, culture and society of Halebeedu, which is the erstwhile capital of the Hoysalas. But the stories in the Kaifiyats are facts, but they are often mixed with the oral traditions of storytelling and local records, and therefore not entirely reliable. Back to the history. Everyone agrees that Vinayaditya was the second king of the Hoysalas, and he was the first substantive king of that dynasty, about whom even a little bit is known. But who was the first? Sala, after whom the dynasty is apparently named, or Nripa Kama II? Some Hoysala genealogy charts on inscriptions start with Sala, but they move straight on to Vinayaditya, leaving out mentioning Nripa Kama. But other inscriptions mention him in volume, and 2 inscriptions found in Hassan mention Nripa Kama and say that he was the father of Vinayaditya. The debate is whether Nripa Kama and Sala were the same man, or were they 2 different kings in succession. Now the second possibility of there being 2 different people is alluded to by Benjamin Lewis Rice. His Hoysala genealogy charts mention both Sala reigning from 1006 AD and Nripa Kama from 1026. But this story has been debated among historians and not really accepted, and the common sense aspects of the discoveries and the possible conclusions that one can draw. And while this debate has continued for a very long time, for us it is not material because there is very little to know about either Sala or Nripa Kama except that they were close affiliates of the Gangas. And the fact that they were affiliates is very likely by some of the conclusions that the Hoysala mentioned on the Kaliyur inscription is likely to have been Nripa Kama, whether or not he was also the famous Sala. Now speaking of affiliations, like every feudatory in history, the Hoysalas too lived by affiliations. Now they may have been chieftains under the Gangas in the succeeding years. They are also known to have been feudatories of the Western Chalukyas, and there is also the evidence that they were associated with the Choras and assisted them in military campaigns. Anyway, back to the Battle of Kaliyur. After the 18 chieftains had lost the battle, it would appear that the Hoysala chieftain, who was among them, returned to his chieftainship of the Malnad area. And if this had happened, it could only have been with the blessings of the Choras. Mackenzie corroborates this view, and by that, it is a suggestion, implied or otherwise, that Hoysala would have made some sort of peace with the Choras and that he was appointed as the Zamindar of the Choras in Malnad. As we know from the earlier episodes, the Choras directly administered only such core areas of the conquered territory that mattered to them the most and kept a rather loose grip on the outer peripheries of their kingdom, leaving it to people like zamindars or vassals or feudatories. Now, Malnad would have been one such area, outlying and remote, except to the extent of Belur itself, which was an important trade hub and would have been important, if not central, to the Chola scheme of administration. And maybe it was only a time before they found the need to assert their authority over that region. And sure enough, one inscription mentions a military engagement between Nripa Kama and Rajendra Chora's general Kannamma. The inscription has been dated back to 1022 AD, and so the battle must have happened before then. Incidentally, on this and similar inscriptions, Nripa Kama is mentioned as Nripa Kama II. And again, I remind people that Hoysala is the Hale Kannada version of Hoysala. It's a phonetic evolution. Another inscription describes the same conflict, stating that the Chora army quelled the Hoysalas in the Battle of Mani. But the earliest known mention of Hoysala predated the one at Kaliur by several years and dates back to 950 AD. It mentions the Noramba Anniga, against whom a Hoysala Maruga fought and died. Now, this might suggest that early Hoysala had a Rashtrakuta affiliation. At any rate, it tells us that the Hoysalas were politically active for decades before we heard the story of Sala and the tiger, an event most used to describe the origin of the Hoysalas. The extent and reach of the early Hoysalas has puzzled historians for decades. Despite piecing together nuggets from various inscriptions, and even though the events mentioned are within a reasonably tight time span, it has led to a variety of conclusions. For example, one line of thinking suggests that their location in the desolate hills of Malnad would have been too remote or too insignificant for any of the Deccan rulers to worry about, whether they were the Choras or the Chalukyas. So it stands to reason that the Hoysalas had to bring the action to the plains. And there is the undisputed fact that the Hoysalas rose from being a public menace to the plains dwellers to a position of political prominence. Yet, there are records of Nripa Kama engaging in battle at Banavasi, which lies almost 230 kilometers north of Belur, and this suggests that the Hoysalas were aligned with the Western Chalukyas in some military capacity, giving them the ability to conduct logistics over 200 kilometers away. Now, my own takeaway from all of this is that by the time of Nripa Kama, the Hoysalas had already gained the grounding and political sophistication that would have made them serious contenders for the top job. By the time Vinayaditya took over as Hoysala king in 1047 AD, it is clear that the Hoysalas, either in victory or defeat, had made their presence felt across the region. And by the efforts of his predecessors, Vinayaditya started his reign on a secure footing and was able to set in place an agenda for the growth of the kingdom. Of course, things would be too simple without some missing pieces, but this one was a missing piece of 20 years. And I'll leave you now with this last conundrum. We have no inscriptions from Nripa Kama beyond, say, 1027 AD, and it is not until 1047 AD that Vinayaditya makes his first appearance in Hoysala history. And that leaves us a gap of 2 decades between the time that we think Nripa Kama's reign ended and the beginning of Vinayaditya's. Now, if we assume that the two were father and son and that one succeeded the other, the only real guesses we can make is that either Nripa Kama lived long past 1027 or that Vinayaditya must have begun his rule before 1047. Or that there was someone in between or something happened in that time, but none of this mystery has been recorded and therefore not resolved. Much of our history is based on such loose evidence and folklore, and it is only through the mastery and skill of epigraphists, starting with Benjamin Lewis Rice, through to all his successors, that we have been able to come to some sanity and debate about what happened, even if very often that is not all that really happened. In my next episode, I start with the reign of Vinayaditya as the Hoysalas crank-start their engine of growth, and I will walk you over to the most interesting of the line, Vishnuvardhana. All of that excitement and more is coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.